So the NDIS access and how it really works. So it's really now not just about a diagnosis. So for so long, it's been, having that tick box, do you fit these words and these categories? So the diagnosis really is just the first step. So it's not always necessary to have a diagnosis to access the NDIS, and we'll speak a bit more about that through the early intervention pathway. So I think I missed one bit at the bottom, Tara.
Oh, sorry. I didn't.
Sorry. So a person can meet access to the NDIS through both disability requirements, which is under Section 24 of the legislation, and early intervention requirements. So now you can jump across. So Section 24 of the legislation talks about disability requirements. So this is where somebody has a lifelong permanent disability. So something that results in significant impairments to their life and impacts their functional capacity, which is a real focal point, and we'll give some more information on that. Early intervention requirements. So this is where someone may benefit from some support and interventions in order to reduce the supports that they may need down the track. So this is particularly for children under the age of 6 with identified global development delay. So a participant can meet access under both the early intervention and the disability requirements, depending on what pieces of the puzzle they fit in there.
Okay.
All right. So you're lucky I can't see you because I get the job of talking to you all about legislation, which is pretty bloody boring, not going to lie. So I'm trying to make it as interesting to you all as possible because it's really important, especially as parents of little people, that you understand this. So please make sure you put your questions in as we go through because it is a little tricky to understand. But children are currently the ones that are being reassessed, having their eligibility reassessed the most by NDIS at the minute. And so I see a lot with us being a paediatric provider, people not understanding the difference between meeting disability requirements and meeting early intervention requirements. And there's this little bit of misconception that that early intervention is only for children, because I know that was definitely my assumption when I first, when Pippa first got access, but it's actually not. So this is what I'm really hoping to unpack for you guys because it's going to give you power when it's coming up to those re-eligibility conversations. So when we're talking about meeting the disability requirements, the NDIS is looking for 3 main things. So they're looking for a permanent or lifelong disability diagnosis. They want to know what is the impairment of the disability. Now, in the past, so this actually isn't new, to be fair. This part of the legislation has always been there, that it's supposed to be disability, which equals impairment, which then equals functional impact, right? However, before the changes in October 2024, we had a really big principle-based system. And it was sort of going, well, if you've met access for disability and you've demonstrated to us that there's an impairment, you can go along and spend your money, and as long as it's in relation to disability, we kind of, there used to be operational guidelines saying you don't need to apply to have that disability recognised. I still have a copy of them. I like to look at them and cry and weep and remember good old days. Whereas now, and this is sort of like leading into the notice of impairments part that we're going to be talking about at the end, it needs to be really clearly demonstrated that you have a disability which equals one of 6 impairments, which we'll go into. And then it's because of those impairments that there is a massive impact on functional capacity. And I think we can go to the next slide to help me understand that. Right. So when we're talking disability, we're talking things that your kid does not grow out of. Okay. Cerebral palsy, autism, Mind you, though, we had a child, had someone lose access the other week because they might grow out of their autism. It's just, you have to laugh. Like you really have to laugh sometimes. And obviously we can support them to overturn that. But this is why having this understanding, I think, is so important for families. So having a disability, though, so epilepsy is sometimes a really good example of just having epilepsy does not mean that you have that you can meet access to NDIS, because what one person's epilepsy looks like is going to be completely different to what another person's epilepsy will look like. Same with cerebral palsy as well. We've got different levels of cerebral palsy which have different access requirements. So does your child's disability, does it affect their ability to take part in everyday life? And so that's the things. What are kids doing? They're outside kicking balls. They're hanging out with their mates. They're going to school. They're going to playgroup. You know, we're not talking about, you know, massive things here. We're really, really practical. And so then that disability has to lead to the impairments. Now, the impairments are already mapped. They're classed under some medical jargon, okay? So the NDIS have already got it mapped, and so it's not public information. It's it is available publicly under freedom of information. However, it's not something that you can look at on the NDIS website, all right? So one or more of these impairments, so we've got intellectual, cognitive, neurological, sensory, physical, or psychosocial. Psychosocial and children is a whole other realm. So for today, I'm going to just pretend psychosocial doesn't exist, because I think it's just easier, and we could maybe do another whole webinar on psychosocial disability at another time.
Mm-hmm.
Then we need to have and demonstrate what the functional impact of that impairment is. So let's use autism. Autism is classified as a neurological impairment. And so we need to be able to demonstrate in the evidence we provide to NDIS that the neurological impairment of autism really impacts our child's the way that they communicate, the way that they interact in the community, the way they learn, the way they move, their self-care and self-management. Now, they don't need to know, doesn't need to impact all of those things, okay? Let's be very clear. It does not need to impact all of those things, but when we're considering access, it must impact one or more of those things. I'm going to pause there because that was a lot of information. Any questions? No? I'm looking there. Okay. All right.
Tabitha.
So early intervention. So that is one area, like we said, that you can meet access or a participant can meet access to the NDIS, with the hope that then with that early help that they will be able to reduce their impacts and their need for support going forward in the future. Next one. So how is early intervention access different to disability? So people with a permanent and significant disability are unlikely to undergo a re-eligibility assessment. Whereas under early intervention, with the impact of this early intervention, this may reduce their needs for supports down the track. And this is where global development delay will sit for children under the age of 6. So with that, you're likely to be reassessed for eligibility as the participant goes through, because the needs and request and access eligibility may change through that. Next one. So with a global development delay, so this early intervention support, so what the NDIS are looking for is a impairment, so one or more of these. So the participant must be impacted through intellectual, cognitive, neurological, sensory, physical, or psychosocial, or they are under the age of 6 with a global development delay diagnosis. So early intervention is not necessarily always for children. So there's a bit of a misconception and understanding there. So if a participant is an adult, they may still meet access under the early intervention if they meet those one or more of the impairment criteria. So the participant must also benefit from the supports of NDIS, so reducing the functional impact in daily life activities, reduce future support needs, prevent them deteriorating, improve their capacity, and strengthen the family supports.
And I think this is a really good opportunity to touch base in terms of early intervention. What we generally see is that the improved daily living budget is bigger. So when we're thinking, well, what is the difference between disability requirements and early intervention? All of us who have little people who are under the age of 6, you will notice that their improved daily living budget is very, very healthy from a therapy perspective. And once they hit 6, and pretty much by the time they're 9, it's almost down to 1/3. So that's what we're talking about with early intervention. Adult examples of early intervention is sort of acquired brain injury later on in life. So they'll probably meet access under disability and early intervention, so that there can be sort of quite intensive support sort of for those first 6 to 12 months that someone comes onto the scheme. So that might help to try and wrap your head around it. And let me just have a look at Kelly's question.
Yeah, I thought this was good to cover now.
Good question, Kelly. So this, you would have seen in the slide how we had unlikely written underlined. So with the disability requirements, ASD is technically a disability, so with level 2. However, if you're saying you've met early intervention, I don't know if you want to write in the chat, did you get a notice of impairments if you're a new participant? And did it say, did you meet the disability requirements and the early intervention requirements? Because that will really help in that instance. I'm just going to assume you didn't meet the disability requirements, and then it is likely that you would be reassessed at some point if you are only on early intervention. However, they need to demonstrate that. I can see if you think it just said early intervention. Okay, so they would need to demonstrate that your impairments have reduced, okay? And you would need to be able to demonstrate that, that it's kind of not working in order for them to kick you off the scheme, all right? So early intervention is actually quite hard to get kicked off of because you need to demonstrate it's not working. So there is that fine line. And you also have a disability diagnosis. And I can see you've asked, do I need to pay for another ASD diagnosis? No. So you've already got your diagnosis. This is around demonstrating the functional impact. So with you being quite new to the scheme, it will take time to be able to determine, well, now that you've had early intervention, we're going to do this re-eligibility assessment. Do you then meet the disability requirements? Because it's, I guess, your functional impact capacity isn't getting better. And so you could then move over to section 24 and be classed under the disability requirements. Or at the minute, it might be that you don't need NDIS support anymore because the early intervention has done what it's supposed to do. I hope that makes sense.
You may also find as an adult coming onto the system, some of the things that we do see is that the adult may be given early intervention funding, and this is where your planner or your LAC will go through your plan, or they should go through your plan and the implementation notes to tell you like what the purpose of your plan was. So for some adults, it may be that initial ASD diagnosis, yes, you've got the diagnosis, you don't need that again, but it doesn't necessarily outline the functional impacts on your daily life. So the early intervention funding is there to enable you to see an OT, a psychologist, people like that, to then be able to assess the functional impact and provide maybe a functional capacity assessment using your funding. So then that can determine that eligibility going forwards and provide that evidence.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I can see Katie, can you get this after a child turns 6 but there isn't a diagnosis? If there is still need for intervention so they don't decline. Let me just double check. I just want to see. Okay, so I was just checking what we've got to move on. So in terms, this is a tricky one. So if the child's turned 6 and there's no diagnosis, then they're technically under global development delay, and we are going to go into the global development delay in a minute. I won't get onto that. However, where the difference here is, Katie, is that there still needs to be the impairment, all right? So if there's no diagnosis and the child's over 6, so we can't rely on the global development delay, for lack of a better word, label, then what is the impairment? Okay, how are you going to demonstrate the impairment? So that's the really hard part from an early intervention perspective, is you still need to have some form of evidence showing there is a physical impairment, an intellectual impairment, a cognitive impairment, which you can do through a functional capacity assessment and different things like that. Okay, so I'm just looking. Katie's got speech delay, social challenges, physical. Yep, but they would still, that's the functional impact. And this is that really hard where we're splitting hairs, and the thing about legislation and why it can be so hard to get onto NDIS. So the speech delay, the social challenges, and the physical functional impact all have to be coming from an impairment. All right, so we need to sort of go a little bit higher up. And I guess that's where the evidence, you need to talk to your doctor, essentially, to go, what impairment can you put this under, for lack of a better word? So, for instance, my daughter's chromosomal thing is not a recognised disability, right? She hasn't met the disability access for that. However, she has still met the impairment requirements, because it's still a cognitive impairment or an intellectual impairment as part of the NDIS stuff. And I realise that I feel like I'm talking a completely different language.
No, it's making sense to me.
Good. And then excellent. Thank you. And then the functional impairment is her speech delay, the social challenges, and the physical stuff. Okay, yeah. It's really tricky to get your head around. I also just want to say just because you don't have a diagnosis doesn't mean you can't meet access. There are cases of kids who are 12, 13, 14 on the scheme, whose only diagnosis is global development delay, because we don't know what the issue is. However, there is enough evidence to demonstrate the significant functional impact. All right. So sensory could be the impairment due to social challenges. Absolutely. So if you could, for instance, demonstrate sensory processing disorder, which in itself would not meet the disability requirements. However, if you've got evidence of the impairment and you've got evidence that the functional impact is profound, then that's how you play the game. There's more questions.
There is one more here. Yeah, we might answer before we move on.
How do I find out if my son's diagnosis meets the disability requirements? Have you got a crystal ball, Catherine? Because sometimes I feel like we just need to, they just make this stuff up. No. So there is, and I'm not sure where it's been put, but there is a thing of, this is where I can get a little bit too technical, and I might need Tabitha and Tara to pull me in, because us support coordinators like to get really stuck on the legislation, and then we have what the NDIS do. So basically, NDIS have created this stupid lists called List A, List B, and List D. Okay. So anything on List A, and we'll include this in the recording, a link to List A, you can pretty much guarantee that you'll meet the disability requirements with very little additional evidence. Okay. Then you've got List B, where they go, yeah, we know that this is a disability per se, but we need a lot more information because the spectrum is so broad. So a good example would be cerebral palsy. If it's level 4 or 5, it's automatic disability requirements. However, if it's level 1, 2, or 3, they go, well, yes, we can see that. However, we need to understand what the functional impact is. So it's not a pass go. Yeah, it's not a straight in. But the thing to remember is these lists were created by NDIS. Okay, these lists are not legislation, and this is what pisses me off to no end, because this is all that the NDIS have done. So this is where I don't want you to get too hung up on, is this a List A, is this a List B diagnosis, because it's a load of codswallop if you've got the right evidence. Yeah. And so I seen someone say, what evidence do you need? If you sort of look at it in layers, okay, we need something from a specialist doctor as like a diagnosis, a medical diagnosis is the first thing. Something from your GP won't suffice. We need like a specialist diagnosis. And then you need to demonstrate that it's permanent, and and I'll keep using Pippa. So Pippa's my daughter. So she has Wiedemann-Steiner syndrome, which is dodgy chromosomes, okay? Not recognized. But underneath, as a part of that, she has an intellectual disability, which we had to get done officially, which I think will help make the understanding. So with her Wiedemann's, that would be a List B. So it wasn't recognised and we didn't meet access. So we've now then had to go and get an intellectual disability assessment done by a psychologist. And so there's that diagnosis there. And now we have to get her paediatrician to write around her low tone. So Pippa has a PEG. She needs a wheelchair for long distances. She's got crappy fine motor skills, all that sort of stuff. But I need to now go and get a doctor to put that in writing, a specialist doctor, to say that medication won't fix it. Nothing's going to fix it. This is her for life. So there's my medical evidence. Mm-hmm. And then I need to go and pay another $4,000 for another functional capacity assessment, which then aligns to those disabilities. Okay. Yeah. But I can use her NDIS plan for the functional capacity assessment. I can't use her NDIS plan for the diagnostic assessments. All right. Mm-hmm. And even though some psychologists will charge your NDIS plan and go, they can do it, you technically can't.
Yeah. Okay.